Well, welcome to the Trauma Certificate Information Session. And I'm Mary Bussey, glad to see you all here. And you probably all know Michelle Sinkwitz. You work with her for field, or if you don't, she's here to help us with the field portion, which is a really big part of every certificate. So I'm really glad you're here. I typed this up, and it gives you sort of an overview of what's involved in the certificate, but there's always questions, because there's always new things, new interests students have. But the certificate has been in existence since about 2003, it began, and it really came about through student interest. Students who had heard a speaker in a mental health class that I taught, and her specialty was trauma. We were making the link between all mental health diagnoses and trauma, not just PTSD, some depression and anxiety. So the students petitioned for a class in trauma, and 10 people signed up for it and took it, and then that started the ball rolling, and we developed a certificate. And yeah, so it has grown from 15 people in the very first year that it was done. I think last year, or this current year, graduating students, there are 62. What we do as a school, because there is no cap, like, oh, well, we can only let in 62 people, when you will turn in your planning forms for next year, and it'll be online, and it'll cover the whole year. It'll show the classes you want, and at the bottom there'll be a box or top for certificate. If you check trauma certificate, then you're in the certificate, kind of conditional upon getting an appropriate field placement. Once you get your field placement that links up with your clinical track and trauma, then that's confirmed, you're in. And at that point, when Jean East has and Sarah Sweetman have all of the student planning forms in electronically, they decide how many sections to offer. So it's dependent on student interest. If 75 students signed up, we would have at least 3 or 4 sections. This year there's been 4 sections of each class, even with just the 62 people, trying to keep the class size capped at about 22, 23, and that has worked out. Also, a few people take these trauma courses as an elective. They're not in the certificate. They might just take the first class and stop there, and maybe they have other things they're doing with the rest of their electives. The trauma certificate hours are embedded in your MSW second year, so that you're not taking extra hours beyond the 45 you need for next year. The 2 required classes can be taken as 2 of your 3 open electives. And we count 15 hours of your field placement as contributing to the certificate hours, because DU as a whole has a sort of maximum certificate hours that it requires. And so we'll talk about that a little bit later, that you working with people with trauma into your field placement, and that's why it's such a big part. And so I kind of listed the 2 classes of social work, trauma and recovery and social work practice, and social work interventions for responses to trauma. The last one is a mouthful. I'll get short of that though. Social work interventions for trauma would be easier to say. And I brought the books that are for these classes just to kind of give you at least a visual of what they are, because there are a couple of books that are bought in the first class but carry over, and various readings from it go into the second class. But one book that doesn't carry over but is in the first class, some of you have probably read this, Trauma and Recovery, Judith Herman. A wonderfully classic book, and by classic I don't mean old and outdated. I mean actually quite good. And it's almost like almost every clinician that I'm sort of aware of who works in the trauma field knows this book. In fact, we had a speaker from Bosnia come a couple of years ago, and it was about maybe 4 years ago, and she talked about how little trauma information there was in Bosnia, and it was after this terrible war that had torn country apart, the whole old country of Yugoslavia. And she said, we didn't know what to do, and we were seeing all these walking, shell-shocked, wounded people. We got hold of a sort of, hand-copied copy of Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman. We translated it, and that's what we are using to help people. So it is known worldwide. And then 2 books that start in the first course and carry over into the second. And interestingly enough, they both have empowerment in their title. But Priscilla Dask-Brailsford, A Practical Approach to Trauma, Empowering Interventions. And she's a psychologist at Simmons College in Boston. Just a wonderful book, and her own experience ranges from treating individual trauma in psychotherapy to treating schools where there's been a calamity, a shooting, up in the Northeast area. She wasn't here in Colorado for Columbine. And she also has personally volunteered in, I guess, Louisiana, Mississippi after Katrina. So she knows the individual trauma, the sort of community level, and the whole area level. I really like her book. And then a book that I'm lucky enough to be associated with, Trauma Transformed and Empowerment Response. And me and Judy Wise are the co-editors. Judy was the original trauma certificate coordinator before me. And we have chapters by a lot of people, some of whose names you will know. Lynn Parker wrote Transforming Privilege, Power, and Control in Relationship Trauma. Really good chapter on domestic violence. Jean East and Sue Kenny wrote Response to Poverty as a Form of Transforming Trauma, kind of about their work at Project Rise with low-income women. Susan Manning wrote a chapter on transforming trauma responses to women with serious and persistent psychiatric disability, based on her work with Denver Mental Health Center. I wrote a chapter on agencies dealing with grief after a client death. It doesn't matter whether it's suicide or homicide. In this case, it was a homicide. But, you know, we social workers grieve, and yet we have to go on to see the next client. You know, do we ever take a day off? Not usually, because the need is so great. So that one covers both. And then in the second class on interventions, we get to some more specific types of trauma interventions. So very classic principles of trauma therapy. John Briere, he's also a social worker, I think on staff at the University of Southern California or San Diego. But covering a vast range of interventions, cognitive, a more psychodynamic, emotional, if people need that, kind of go back to their past, and some on somatic, just techniques to lower anxiety. But along that same line of somatic, a book that everyone who teaches this class loves, The Body Remembers Casebook by Babette Rothschild, also a social worker. And she's written The Body Remembers, sort of a large text about how people take trauma in and it stays in their body. And she uses all kinds of unique interventions with different people depending on what they need. And it may just involve imaginal sort of thinking. One is called running, but it's not like actual running. That might be good too, kind of a running intervention. But it's having a rape victim imagining running. And it's funny that just imagining it causes some muscle changes and creates something new going on in the brain. So a nice kind of, everything in there is a case where she'll show what she said and then what the client said back. She probably had permission to record the cases. So I really like it because it's pragmatic. So this is how she worked with this person. So that's the 2 classes. I should stop and ask if people have questions.
Do you need to take them in order?
Yes. Yeah, the first one is a prereq for the second one. And we've been noticing that every year there's a few. We should really make the prereqs stand out on the banner system, because right now there's some people who are interested in getting into the second trauma course who missed having the first. And we're setting up a system where they basically have to do all the reading and all the homework from the first class to get in. And they won't be in the trauma certificate, but you know, you're in a class and everybody has the same experience, and then someone comes in new who hasn't read any of that, it doesn't work as well. So we're saying, if you're willing to do that work, and that is work, then we'll make a waiver for you. Though that's not quite the idea. But yeah, and timing of the classes. Here's how it's been for the last 2 or 3 years, and we can assume it might be this way for the next year. There's always been one section offered in the summer, which I know for continuing students would have bad financial implications, unless you have a package of some kind that actually covers summer. So we've had one section in the summer and 3 in the fall of that first class. And then they spread the next four sections of the second class, 2 in winter, 2 in spring. And I know it's not ideal to take your final class on conventions in the spring when you're about to graduate. It's kind of, I wish I'd known that earlier. But it seems to be the only way the schedule can accommodate all of our sections. So, just to kind of give you a heads up on when these are off. So the field part, which is actually a very interesting part, there are agencies who will have flagged in the database and at the Fieldfare, there'll be a literal flag, a little purple type flag, that they consider themselves appropriate for the trauma certificate. Now, there's also some agencies that you look at them on the face, you go, well, I know they see clients with trauma there, like any mental health center does, all mental health centers. But they might not have flagged it because maybe they were thinking, oh, you have to have like trauma in the title, or like I'm a rape crisis center. They know their trauma. So if it doesn't identify it, that doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't pursue it. It means think about that, and I'm going to ask Michelle to say, you know, should they consult with someone from field? Should they go on an interview? But, you know, places that you pretty much know do treat trauma, but maybe they haven't put it in their write-up.
Okay, so you'll have the whole month of March, you probably know this already, to prepare for Fieldfare. Okay, so in that time, March 4th and 5th, Andy is going to do a series of brown bags on Thursdays and Fridays to actually walk you through the second year database. Okay, at that point, the switch will be flipped, so to speak, and you'll all have access. Okay, we're asking people not to contact, we do this every year, not to contact the agencies until Fieldfare, because we're working with them to clean up some of this stuff, right? Make sure that what they said last year still holds for this year, how many slots, what certificates, what tracks, all of that. But that month is for you to do your research, okay? So suppose you find an agency like Marion's saying, and it's Mental Health Center of Denver, but it doesn't have the trauma certificate checked. Put that on your list. You can ask them at Fieldfare. You can make sure that it's included in your interview questions. There's a big thing on the back of your paper that Marion wrote about internship requirements, and I think it spells it out really well, so I don't need to rehash all of it. You don't have to go in September and be treating people for trauma. We hope you're not, actually, okay? Think about yourselves or people you know who have had some kind of traumatic experience. You want someone who has some experience, right? Okay, so we're hoping to give you by this the knowledge, the exposure, the framework, the theoretical basis, so that you can do that kind of work, but we're not expecting that you walk into your second year field placement and do that, okay? You may not even do trauma treatment by the end, but maybe you're doing case management with clients who have had some kind of a trauma, or maybe you're doing family therapy and one of the clients has had some kind of trauma, okay? So there needs to be trauma-related practice, but it doesn't mean you're going in doing EMDR in October, for example. Okay, so I just want to clarify that, because every year people go in and then they want to interview and the agencies are like, really? I mean, you don't even know our agency to know how to do an assessment here, and you want to do this kind of intervention. Okay, so just give yourself, you know, see it as a process for learning all of the content, for having the exposure, and then ask in your interviews, do you see clients with trauma? Now maybe people will laugh at that, because almost if you think about the range of agencies, people who are homeless, people who are in the child welfare system, people who are, you know, obviously like at RAP, at the Rape Awareness and Assistance Program, you're going to obviously see people with trauma. But there's also other kinds of mental health issues, as Marion was saying, that are so connected. You know, almost every diagnosis you can trace back to some kind of trauma, okay? So pretty much the range of clinical placements that we have are okay, but we still suggest that you ask in the interview, okay? If it's not in the database, doesn't matter. The database is created, each agency creates their own record, okay? Because we can't create 650 records and keep them updated. So if somebody went in and checked animal assisted, maybe they thought they could only check one certificate, okay? Or maybe they didn't check any certificates. They checked families track, high-risk youth track, and they didn't do that. Or maybe the internship coordinator changed and they don't know what our trauma certificate program is. It's kind of like this moving target that we're always trying to get the information as accurate as can be, okay? So if it seems to you like the clients have trauma in their history, most likely, then ask about it. And assume that it will work rather than the opposite, okay? If you need to consult, we'll have a system where Kate and Julianne and I will all be available to do consulting throughout the process. It's different than your first year where you all had to meet with Kate, and this is all driven by you. So you can start with a list of 40 agencies if you want and winnow it down based on the Fieldfare and your research and such, okay? And then do your interviews from there. You don't have to clear anything, you don't have to be approved for anything, you have to take the responsibility for making sure that it matches your track and your certificate. Okay, questions?
Yeah, so do schools normally count for this then, like since they certainly can see trauma?
Yes, it
Okay.
can. It depends, right?
Yeah.
I would ask the field instructors. Some of them are very well versed in it, and it kind of depends on what kind of social work that school counselor does.
Okay.
Some schools are so focused on IEPs and crisis intervention
Right.
that they rarely have any ongoing work. I currently supervise 2 students in a school, and they have courses that start in September and go through May.
Okay.
And so in a setting like that,
Okay.
it would absolutely. Some of the more experiential schools, we have schools that are in inpatient hospitals, we have schools that are in criminal justice systems for kids under 18, we have school settings that are alternative schools. There's all kind of things that would count for school settings if you're looking towards being a school social worker, but would definitely fit for this also.
Okay.
I'm not sure just the typical elementary school would, unless you clarify that with your field instructor. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that because schools and hospitals, purely medical hospitals, not obviously a psychiatric hospital would count. They form a special category, 2 special categories. So schools depends on the district and the principal, depends on the social work department. But I noticed that some schools don't really let their social workers do much direct practice. They kind of function to do IEPs. Other schools, like Cherry Creek, Douglas schools, very much a social work department that sees students individually, group. So it's the district and the principal of each school. And then medical hospitals. You'd think that, well, an ER, that would be a place where there would be people with trauma. Now, if you just say trauma to anyone in the medical field, they're going to think cut arms, and they're going to say, yeah, we have a trauma unit. By that, they mean stitching up people. But if you ask them about psychological trauma, if you go to hospital, and with many people, the trauma is actually with the family, not the person who may be actually unconscious. So, but then do they spend much time with that family? Sometimes there's a bit of grief work going on, and there's an interesting overlap between grief and trauma, because not all grieving and bereavement is traumatic. We all die, and there's sort of a human life cycle. But there is a lot of new information out about traumatic grief. Grief that happens too soon, someone taken from us in a very horrific manner. So, so hospitals they are aware, some hospitals, that they are working with families who are traumatically grieving. You kind of have to ask, just like with schools, does the hospital unit, and each social work, the same hospital could have many different social work units, an ER unit, neonatal unit. Transplant units, for instance, you'd think, well, surely people who are on a transplant list or even getting dialysis, that's traumatic. But you do kind of have to ask, because the only time we've ever had a no from an agency who actually told, this was Ginny Rubio, who was here a few years ago, she called to ask them if that would be an appropriate place for a trauma certificate student. And the social worker said, no, I don't know anything about that. I can't supervise them. And of course, I'm forgetting completely which hospital it is. It was a guy, social worker. Well, you wouldn't want to go somewhere where someone said, no, we can't actually talk about trauma. Because talking about clients' trauma is part of supervision. It's part of the expectations. You'll put it on your IFEP, and it'll be then kind of rated as you go along the 3 quarters on your field evaluation, just whatever goals for working with trauma you put down. But I just want to reinforce what Michelle said, and I hope I've said it right here in writing, that there's direct trauma interventions with someone who's willing to receive them, such as someone coming to the VA to a PTSD unit. That person is there for trauma treatment. They know it. But someone in a homeless shelter who's had a ton of trauma, if you say too early to them, so let's talk about your trauma. I think it's affecting how you're not getting an apartment. Well, they are not making any link between their current homelessness and all the vast trauma they suffered in their teenage years. It's coming out of the blue, and they're and they may walk away. So sometimes trauma intervention takes a long and sideways road to establish trust and safety. I'm kind of pulling that from Judith Herman. She has stages, and the first stage is safety. Safety could last an entire year, and it's not bad work if it does. Even if you never move up to stage 2, there's actually authors who talk about with people with very complex trauma staying in the safety stage, which is a lot like supportive counseling, and never moving beyond that stage, not suggesting EMDR or any kind of, not even suggesting anything somatic, is actually really good trauma work. So trauma work is a vast field. It doesn't just mean, doing the highest level of trauma processing of the bad memory. That's for someone who's ready to do that. But we have many clients who are not ready to do that. And it would scare them and they'd leave. So I hope that actually sounds reassuring, that we have no set expectation that you're going to do this. We just know you're going to work with clients who've had trauma, and you're going to use your own inner judgment about how can I help them through this. Doesn't even have to, the word trauma doesn't have to come out of my mouth. How can I help them through where they are right now, thinking about trauma?
So you mentioned a couple of times to ask in the interview. Is it appropriate to ask ahead of time? Because I feel like if you know you want to do this, then it would be kind of a waste of time to go into the interview not knowing.
Yeah, you can, at Fieldfare, some students find it a really good opportunity and some students find it totally overwhelming. And it depends on who you are, okay? If you come and you have your list ahead of time of, say, 20 possibilities, you could use that time to ask them, have you ever had anyone in the trauma certificate program, or what kind of work do you, and check people off based on that. I just meant that you really want, in the individual interview, I would hope that no one would take a second-year field placement without meeting their field instructor. I hope you all know from this year how important it is to click with that person, okay? I have a little inside joke about that. So don't take a field placement until you've had that interview, okay? And in that interview, that person may or may not be at Fieldfare. Some of the big school systems, hospital systems, mental health systems, they send 1 or 2 reps who are like their internship coordinators. But then they have 15 different sites that may or may not have MSWs that take interns, okay? So that's why you can't always do it ahead of time. Some agencies will come to Fieldfare with a calendar, and they'll want to schedule people in right then, okay? If you do that, you might have an interview in a week, and you might as well just go on it. If they say, we'll get back to you, or you'll get back to them, then there's time with email exchanges or phone calls in the meantime to ask those questions. So it's so, every agency's different with their process, but just make sure that before you accept it, you have the answers to the questions that you want. Are there other field questions?
This might be getting real tiny, but if you ask someone, do you do trauma work here, they may say no, thinking that has to be EMDR. But if you say, do you see clients who've had trauma in their background, that's the question.
That's the question they ask.
And hopefully they know the answer to that question. And for most all mental health settings, the answer is yes. So, and things like your supervision hour when you're discussing clients with trauma, the note-taking that you're doing on these clients when you're filling in your case notes, all of that counts. So when we say 50% of your time, count all the time that's devoted to client work with trauma, people who've had trauma, even the behind the scenes work, where you're getting supervision and writing things up, so.
Okay, I'm gonna run. If people have questions, just stop by my office next to Kate, or email anyone on the field team, really, and we can help you through the process.
Thank you. I was also gonna say that until a few years ago, we did interviews for all the trauma certificate students. I like that. But not having interviews now, if you would like to talk more about the trauma certificate, get in touch with me. This quarter and next quarter, I have office hours on Thursdays, like around the noon hour. But I'm also here at various odd hours at other times, late in the day some days, early some other days, let me know. And I do have, in very bad shape, but I'm gonna try and get them in better shape, lists of all the past trauma certificate placements where students have been. I don't always know whether they liked it or not, because I don't teach all 8 classes, you know. So that's where a professor would actually find out if there's any that really aren't working. We assume that the field knows that and would weed them out if there's any that really didn't work out well. I mean, I'm aware of some where it didn't work out well, but it was kind of a mismatch from the start. I should probably say something about the fact that in some prior years, we have had students in the community track also take the trauma certificate. But there are some very clinical assignments, including one where you do process notes and you write up a meeting with a client, and the client could be a single person, a family, or a group, someone might be in. And if a person is in the community track and never sees clients, then that assignment is not going to happen. And sometimes students try to sort of quickly, and not in their normal work as a community student, somehow get a client at the end just to do that assignment. And you know, that's not ideal either. So field and all of us made the decision last year, the overlap between community track student and trauma certificate does not work. So that's the only time I've ever noticed a problem with someone who was actually doing that. But other than that, students, it's worked out very well. But yeah, I'd be happy to talk to you via email or in person or phone about whether I know anything about emergency.
Do we learn EMDR in the classes?
No, you know, you're asking such a good question. EMDR is one of those proprietary, you know, patented, copyrighted things. One of our professors, Tana Powell, she uses EMDR all the time. If you do get a placement at RAP, Rape Awareness and Assistance Project, I think they send their interns to the EMDR training. It's a fairly expensive training, and there's like 2 levels. It's probably a little bit cheaper at the student rate, so if you're interested, but I mean, it's significant. It might be in the 3 figures, if I'm remembering correctly, as opposed to the 2, or in the 4 figures, as opposed to even 3 figures. Might cost in the thousands. But some of the principles of EMDR are almost embodied in other types of sort of body work. I am a huge fan of EMDR, and anybody interested in learning it, I think you'd find it fascinating. But it's a very specific protocol. It's not just as simple as either a finger doing like this or taps. Though, if you go to the web and look up, what is her name? I'm going to forget now. But it's the author of a book called Tapping In, and that's a new book if you're interested. She has, of course I can't remember her name, but she has a website and she gives some sort of simple EMDR-inspired exercises. And she says, she has a caveat on her website and in her book, Tapping In. This is not for extreme and deep trauma. This is for people to tap in assets, like you're kind of tapping, and by tapping in, she's kind of meaning doing like this to your own knees, tapping in positive thoughts that might help you overcome a hurdle that you're facing. So I'm a very big proponent of EMDR, and it is something you have to take from the EMDR Institute people. So I'm glad you asked that. might give you a little free time before your next class, a little sunshine. And thank you for